The image of the railways in the 1930s is one of success. The Great Western's chocolate and cream coaches were an enduring symbol of a railway at the height of its power and prestige. Every schoolboy knew the Cornish Riviera Express, with its magnificent castles and kings, and railways were the accepted way to travel, whether for pleasure or for work, for passengers or for freight. But the 30s started on a sour note. The strikes of the 1920s had foreshadowed growing social unrest, and the Wall Street crash had heralded the Great Depression, which was to dominate the early years of the decade. On the railways, there was a downturn in business, which was to result in the laying up of many locomotives. However, this coincided with a time when many locomotives were due for replacement in any event. The golden era of the late Victorian and early Edwardian times having produced a large stock of locomotives reaching the end of their economic lives by the beginning of the 30s. On no railway was this more apparent than on the Great Western Railway. The abolition of the broad gauge in 1892 and the consequent re-equipping of the locomotive stock which had taken place under Dean and Churchwood had resulted in a requirement to rebuild or replace many. The 1940s had begun. Austerity was to be the key word in the early 1940s. It was to be applied to those steam locomotives built to the order of the War Department, mass production of which commenced in 1942. These 280s were a development of the Stanier 8F class, many of which were built at the beginning of the war for general use on Britain's railways. The austerities were designed for short-term use at minimum cost and had anticipated lives of just 2 years. They were intended for use overseas, and 935 were built by the end of the war. In addition, large numbers of 060 saddle tanks were built to ministry order, based on a standard Hunslet industrial design. Many of these engines would be sold into private ownership after the war, including a number to the LNER, from which they passed into British Railways ownership as Class J94. The military had been involved with railways from the earliest days. Despite the apparent inflexibility of a railway system, it was unrivaled for mass transportation of troops and equipment. An army operating on foreign soil needed to take over the railways in former enemy territory, so it required troops trained in railway techniques. Curiously, history was to result in the Southern's principal main line from Waterloo to Weymouth becoming the last steam main line of all. A Mansell King Arthur and a Drummond L12, both natives of the line, are followed by one of the byproducts of the Brighton electrification, an N15X 460. These handsome machines were the Brighton's last express passenger engines, built as 464 Baltic tanks. Made redundant in 1933, they were rebuilt as 460 tender engines for use alongside the King Arthurs on the Southwestern Division. They were reclassified N15X in the vain hope that they would match the Arthurs. Mansell's own large 460s, the Nelsons, had been rebuilt by his successor, Bullitt, whose own remarkable Pacifics burst upon the scene in 1941. The locomotive is a merchant navy, and the train is the Down Bournemouth Belle. The first 10 merchants were built in the darkest days of the war, apparently contrary to all government directives to build only locomotives suitable for the war effort. Bullitt claimed they were mixed traffic engines and built 10 more in 1945, during which year the first of a smaller version, the so-called Light Pacifics of the West Country class, appeared. This one has an Up-West of England express. Maunsell's Moguls were the real mixed traffic engines of the Southern. This U-class displays British Railways in full on its tender, in the Southern's sunshine lettering, a style introduced by Bullitt, who was nothing if not a publicist.